Please state your name for the record, sir.
Mark Millslake. I'm 44.
Okay. And can you tell me, what do you remember about the 1990s?
About the 1990s, well, let's see, I graduated from college in 91, so the biggest thing that was going on in the world then was actually the Gulf War against Iraq, and Saddam Hussein, he invaded Kuwait. I think going after oil fields was the main deal, but the U.S. got involved pretty quickly. Beat him back to Iraq in 100 days, if I remember right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you tell me anything you remember about the Vietnam War?
Sure. I would have been really young, probably 5 or 6, when the war was over. My dad, I know, was in the draft lottery, the first one they had, I think, in 1969. And he was kind of lucky. He had a pretty high draft number, so he did not have to go. I don't know if he had to go get the physical exam or anything, but I know he got out of serving. So, and he would have just graduated from college, gotten married, and had me all in that same time period. So I'm glad he didn't have to go.
Did the Vietnam War affect your life in any way?
I don't know that it affected me a whole lot directly, but I remember listening to my dad and others talking, and I knew how unpopular it was, and seemed like we had gone over there for no reason and lost a lot of lives, and also heard a lot about how the guys that went over there were generally poorer and couldn't find a way to get out of the draft. So that didn't seem to be too fair either. There is kind of a tie-in, I guess, historically to, see, when I was growing up in the 80s and in the 90s, the big thing was the Cold War, us against Russia, and everything was, you really lived in fear daily that there was going to be a nuclear war. I mean, I remember thinking about that all the time. And you always heard about how the U.S. and Russia both had 10 times as many missiles as they needed to completely wipe out the other, and if some idiot hit a button somewhere, it was all over. And there were movies about it, and then Reagan came up with his Star Wars defense plan, which was going to have satellites orbiting the Earth that could shoot down missiles that Russia sent against us and all that. So that, I remember growing up with that fear, and I guess part of that came from the Vietnam War, where we were there fighting against the communists. So that's what I remember the most. I also remember being really proud of the U.S. in the Gulf War, because we had basically gotten our butts kicked in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And completely turned the tables in the Gulf War. So I remember being at work. This was when I was in college. I was waiting tables, and we had a TV in the bar. And I remember watching CNN all the time because they had war coverage. And it was probably the first time where you could actually see live video coverage of what was going on in the war. And I'll never forget, there was this one that kind of became famous, this one scene where one of our planes was flying over to take out a bridge, and they were kind of bragging on how good our missiles and our bombs were, because we had guided bombs. And it showed a close-up of this bridge, and our plane's flying overhead, and there's this truck, this one lone truck going across the bridge, and I think it was General Schwarzkopf was saying, and right here's the luckiest man in Iraq today. And he just got over the bridge and the bomb hit. And the bridge disappeared. So, I mean, they had all kinds of stuff like that on TV. It was 24-hour coverage.
That's good.
Yeah, so that was pretty cool.
Well, thank you for your time, Mr. Millslake. It was nice talking to you.
You're very welcome. Appreciate you coming over.
Anytime.
Peyton, and we're going to be interviewing him. What do you remember about the 1960s?
Okay, in the 1960s, I graduated from high school, 1963. graduated from the University of Kentucky in 1967. I was drafted as soon as I got out of college. The drugs were rampant. There was very open immorality. Women were becoming very independent. There were riots and marches during the 60s, both for and against Vietnam and for and against African Americans. And I participated in a lot of those riots. I went to Washington, D.C., and I was there when Martin Luther King was killed. And I was also there during the big peace march. And right after that, I was drafted and I got to be part of the military. That's a long answer to the 60s, but the 60s lasted 10 years.
That's a good answer. What do you remember of the Vietnam War?
Okay, I was graduated from UK in 1967, and in the 60s there was what was called the draft. Every male over 18 was put into a lottery, and if your name was drawn, you went into the military. And if you got a low number, it was guaranteed that you were not only going to the military, but you were going to Vietnam. My number was 343 out of whatever, 6 or 7 million guys. So when I graduated from college, I could not get a job because no employer would hire you. And so I was drafted and sent to be trained at Fort Dix, New Jersey. It's a combat training area. And then once in, I signed up for officer school. And the reason I did was to try to keep from going to Vietnam, thinking maybe the war would end. That was my only purpose. I was accepted. I went to officer school. I came out a platoon leader. And then I was shipped to Vietnam. And I was in an area in the southern part of Vietnam, about 30 nautical miles above Saigon. And in a little village called Phu Loi. And I was a combat engineer, platoon leader, but it was not a face-to-face fighting. We built and tore and blew up bridges, and we repaired tanks and gun tubes, and we were a collection center for weapons. And although we had a lot of incoming bombs and things like that, we were not in face-to-face combat. And I slept right next to a helicopter that protected me, and within probably 10 feet of where I slept, there was always more and more helicopters around me. And also I had a Jeep with a 50 caliber machine gun in the back of it, and that is about a 500-pound weapon. And you would really like it on the street out here if we drove it up and down the street, but the rounds are 7 inches long on it. And just to hold the ammunition, it takes up the whole back seat. So it's like one of those things you see in the movies.
Alright, so how long did you serve?
I was there for 11 and a half months. And I'm trying to think why I wasn't there 12 months. There must have been something come up, but normally your term of service is 12 months. But I was there for 11 and a half. Oh, I know. I went to some additional training before I went over there. I went to train on tanks and experimental weapons, and my specialty was explosives. You probably hear today about a lot of IEDs, improvised explosive devices. My military training specialty on my orders was Master Blaster. I'll blow things up. So if I don't like you or your family, you know, I know how to drop your house.
That's good. At the time, how did the war affect the lives of like you and the other Americans?
Well, the war made you very upset because it's like today, we've got wars going on in Iraq and Afghanistan and a lot of other small wars. And if you knew right now that when you got out of high school you were going to be drafted, you'd be pretty depressed. You wouldn't make any long-term plans. When I was in school, they allowed an exemption for college. And a lot of people went to college in order to keep from going to the war. A lot of my high school friends, college friends, and military friends died. Just a lot of them. And so that kind of impacts your outlook in life too. You probably had friends who died in auto accidents or with cancer, but for someone to die who, you know, is healthy and kind of do the right thing, it's a downer. A lot of people went to drugs and marijuana and real hard drugs, LSD and some stuff like that. I've had a lot of people that worked for me that was just, it just blew their mind. They fried their mind with drugs.
What were your feelings toward the war? Did you agree with it or not?
I agreed in principle with the war. Generally, when the United States goes into war, it's for a good purpose. We're trying to free someone. And in Vietnam, we were trying to keep the South Vietnamese from being taken over by communist North Vietnam. So that's a lofty thing to do to protect, you know, a couple 100 million people from being slaughtered, and they were slaughtered by millions. But it's a good thing that the United States is there to help a small country. The only problem is, in a country where you don't have a democratic form of government, no one's really in charge. You don't have police forces. You don't have churches. You don't have schools for all. Women don't have rights. It's kind of a free-for-all kind of society. And so here comes the United States, and we're all smart, intelligent, organized. And we're coming to protect these little Chinese people. And we think that the way to do it is just to use a lot of artillery and bombs and mortar and chemical weapons, which we did. And at some point in time, the goal that you had to protect all these people, you kind of forget about it. You just go over there and you just want to kill people. And you lose sight of, well, why am I here? You know, am I here to free the South Vietnamese from communist control? Am I here to take over North Vietnam? Which usually the United States doesn't try to take over a country. We try to free people that are there, which is what is going on right now today in Afghanistan and Iraq, and even some of the efforts by Russia to take over some of its border territories. As a United States citizen and a soldier, you're always led to believe that what we're doing is right. It's morally right, and in the big picture it'll make the world a better place to live. But then when you get there, you quickly find that you lose sight while you're there. And you learn that you're there to kill as many people that are considered the enemy as you can, and you forget why. And then when your friends are killed, you really go bananas. And there just comes a point in time where you want to just shoot anything that moves. And sometimes it's a child, and sometimes it's a woman, and sometimes they weren't the enemy after all. You just couldn't recognize that because they all look the same. The North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese all dressed and looked the same. They had black pants and a black shirt and wore what they call a boonie cap, and the women wore the little upside down, but they all looked the same, the North and the South, and they sometimes were your friends and they sometimes were not. I would have to ask you a question. That's a long one, though.
That's it. That's it.
That's it? Okay. You can send a check or you can drop it off on the mail. Okay, now you got 5 people here.
What exactly do you remember about the 1970s?
I think 1970s was sort of a recovery decade after 1960. 1960 was a lot went on, a lot of trouble. Still, as a young man, it's still a scary decade, because you still had the Soviet Union and the United States and the Cold War going on. You still practice getting under your desk in case a nuclear explosion went off, which now it wouldn't have done any good at all, but they told us to do that, you know. And so, but music started to change in 1960. I think they had a revolution of music from the, you know, more of the, it started in the 60s, but it went on into the 70s, from the flat top rock and roll era more to, you know, like Motown, more toward the hard rock era and stuff like that.
What do you remember about the Vietnam War?
I served in Vietnam, and the Vietnam War was, we grew up realizing that we were going to war, and we sort of accepted it, and so I went to Vietnam, and I was stationed in an infantry unit, and was there for a year, in fact a year and 2 days, before I went home, and at the time, I hated it. I hated how miserable you would get, you know, how hot it was, how, you know, the insects, you know, how we were in the jungle, and we would be, you know, sometimes we could go a month or longer without even taking a bath unless we found a creek or a river we could take a bath or change clothes. And you was always under the apprehension and fear that, you know, you was gonna walk into a heavy contact, you know, with the enemy. The 70s was the year that we finally made an incursion into Cambodia, which was highly criticized with the protesters and stuff like that, which wasn't too successful because I think the protesters was too much for the current Nixon administration to allow it to go on. So they pulled back out. And if you're familiar with Cambodia during the Vietnam War, that was a sanctuary for the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, the soldiers we were fighting, and they would come over, and then once the battle ended or something, you know, they might take a licking or something, they'd go back into Cambodia and rest, recuperate, refit, train some more, and we wouldn't go in there. Did some bombing, which was sort of not publicized a whole lot. But now the Vietnam War, I was, at the time, like I say, I hated it, but now, reflecting back, you know, I did what my country was telling me to do, and I don't regret going.
How did the war affect your life?
Well, it affected me, the fact that it made me grow up. I went to Vietnam as an 18-year-old, and after staying a year there, I've come back, and I would see kids my age group, like in college and stuff like that. They seemed younger than me. And I felt older. I would see them doing pranks and stuff, you know, you're familiar with what kids do, and I would think, you know, I don't have the right to do that. You know, I'm older and more mature. It affected me that way. I never did have any mental, physical, or anything problems after Vietnam, even though we were exposed to Agent Orange and everything, and they test us and everything even today. You know, if you come up with certain diseases, that falls under the Agent Orange category. And thankfully, so far, I haven't come down with anything like that.
What were your feelings toward the war? Did you agree with me or not?
You know, back then, I had really no opinion at all on what I agreed or disagreed. In 1970, I think the war, looking back on it, was not prosecuted right. There was too much involvement at the national level, making decisions where I think more decisions should be made down at the unit level in Vietnam and everything. But operations orders down to battalion level sometimes had to be approved by the president. Every time you get it up and down the chain, you know. And there were some areas there where they called a no-fire zone, and where you had to get permission from the village chief to fire, and that provided a place for the enemy to just to stay until they got ready to strike. And so I think the big thing about the war, I don't think it was prosecuted right. The soldiers over there were great. They get a bad rap. They get a bad rap about drugs, about marijuana smoking and all that. I didn't see hardly any of that. You don't see it if you're in an infantry line unit out in the jungle, and your life depends on you and your buddy next to you. You don't want to be high on marijuana. So I didn't see that. I'm not saying it didn't happen back in the rear, but it was a good bunch of soldiers in Vietnam, and they fought well. They did their duty. Some 59,000 of them died on their duty, and 10 times that were wounded, and on both sides. Anyway, I did go back to Vietnam about 2 years ago and met actually some of the soldiers I fought against.
Really?
And we talked, and they had no animosity toward us. They were really friendly, and matter of fact, I was surprised at some hotels they still fly an American flag. Practically everybody speaks English. So I think the civilian population liked the war, but like I say, the way the war was run at that time, I was really negative on that portion.
That's it.
Is that it? Was that okay?
Yes. Thank you. Hancock, and we're going to be interviewing her today about the 1980s and the Vietnam War. Okay, what all do you remember about the 1980s?
Okay, 1980s, I remember, I guess, odd hairstyles and dress, and I remember joining the military, and that's when I started to serve in the middle of the 80s. And I got married in the 80s, and so I guess those are the big things.
Mm-hmm. All right, what do you remember about the Vietnam War?
I remember the early part, or I would say the surge part of the Vietnam War in the middle 60s, watching it, on TV every evening during supper time, watching Walter Cronkite. And then I remember the fall of Saigon in 75. I think those were the two major things I remember about it. And some of the, I guess some of the events when our POWs came home in the early 70s.
Did anyone in your family or anyone you knew serve in the Vietnam War?
Well, my husband did, but no one in my immediate family did. My cousins were all registered for the draft, but they just never got drafted. And then the draft ended. So other than that, nobody in my immediate family did.
How were your feelings toward the war? Did you like it, or did you disagree with it?
I think that at the time, I was more supportive of our troops over there, of course, watching it on TV and seeing like people that could be my big brother fighting in the war. But after looking back on it as I've grown older, I think some of our policies weren't as sound as they could have been. But we maybe militarily won the war, but politically it didn't work out as well as probably could have.
And what all do you remember happening in the United States during when the war was going on?
Oh gosh, I remember the protests. I remember Kent State. I remember the Democratic National Convention in 1968, where there were a lot of fighting going on in the streets, protesting the war. So I guess I remember a lot of turmoil.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it depends on, how old you were during the war, as to how it affected you. I had a friend of mine whose brother served in the war. She was from Eastern Kentucky, and he came home on leave at Christmas time, and I guess he sort of had a premonition, and he told his mom, he said, "I don't think I'll be back." And then he went back to Vietnam and he got killed. So, and his name is on the wall. We went to see his name on the wall. But so some families were affected like that. But I think if you compared it to Iraq, I would say it was more in your living room every night for 4 or 5 years, on the evening news, day after day, what's going on in Vietnam, whether you were a little kid in grade school or whether you were a teenager wondering whether you were going to get drafted, or whether you were a parent having your son overseas. And then if you compare it to Iraq, it seems like that was just kind of going on over there, and you just heard about it every once in a while.
Mhm.
But it wasn't something that was in her living room every day for 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
So, I think it affected the country a lot, and you know, no matter what your age group was at the time, and you know, I think it started in the early '60s with our advisors going over, and the country was more, I would say, behind the president, behind our foreign policy to stop the spread of communism. And as the war progressed, people started wondering, well, why are we fighting over there? And you know, we want to bring our soldiers home. So I think you felt a mood shift in the nation, and maybe in the early '70s, I think the news coverage of the war kind of died down a little bit. So that had people paying less attention to what was going on.
Did you get married before, in the middle, or like after the war?
After.
Mhm.
So yeah, so during the war, like I said, you know, I was more in my, I was growing up then. So it was in, like I said, part of my life at some, you know, in some form or fashion for 10 years. So you know, just hearing about it, obviously I wasn't in it, but. It made me interested in history, I guess, interested in current events and what was going on in our country politically. Maybe it helped shape what I did for my career later on.
Is that good?
That's good. Thank you.
Sweet.
Yeah, yeah.